Yeah, definitely. We all suffer from short-termism, and we're really particularly bad at thinking long-term. But I do think it's starting to show up more and more. I've seen more food system conversation in the last 6 months than I've seen in the last 10 years. And I think when things like ingredients get really expensive or families have to start changing what they're eating, then I think it really hits home. And I would sound that as a warning bell.
Welcome back to another episode of the Force of Nature podcast. Today's conversation is all about food, not just what's on our plates, but the bigger picture on how it gets there. We often talk about investment in infrastructure like roads, housing and energy, but really do we invest in the very thing that sustains us as humans, which is our food system. In New Zealand, we pride ourselves on being a food-producing nation, yet questions remain about our national food security. How resilient are we if global supply chains falter or if climate and market shocks hit closer to home? There's a huge opportunity here in New Zealand. Small farms, localised food systems and community-driven initiatives that have the potential not to only feed us, but strengthen the fabric between our communities. Across regions, we're seeing sparks of innovation and collaboration that point towards a different kind of future where our food is valued and where our farmers and communities work together to create resilience. To unpack all of this, today I'm joined by Angela Clifford, CEO of Eat NZ and the Food Farm, who has been at the forefront of championing a more connected, local and resilient food system here in New Zealand. We'll explore the challenges, the opportunities and most importantly, what's happening on the ground at regional levels that could shape the future of food in New Zealand. So without further ado, let's get into it. How are you today, Angela?
Fighting fit. Awesome.
That's great to hear. So first of all, Angela, when you look at investment in New Zealand, why do you think food systems is often overlooked and what risks does this create for our future as a country?
I think food systems as an idea is a really new idea. I don't think it's something that most people or most players in the food system have actually really put a great deal of thought to. It's not their fault. I think globally food systems is a really quite a new discipline and a new way of framing food. How it shows up in our system is really siloed outcomes. So, for example, one sector in the primary industry does something because that's the best thing for their sector without being able to realise that there's a food system attached to their sector and the decisions they make influence other aspects of the food system. So that makes it really difficult, I think, for a zoomed out or a joined up response. And I also think that's the history of New Zealand food is incredibly siloed. So it's the fact that we haven't had understanding around food systems compounded by the fact that naturally as a country we have quite a siloed food system anyway. So yeah, this is new understanding, I think, for so many people. And to be fair, I can see that people are really trying to embrace it and really trying to understand that a decision over here impacts an entire system over there. And I think that's why we've got to where we are right now.
It's awesome. So you're seeing a bit of a change across the agricultural and food system, sort of embracing this rather than that siloed approach that we've had for such a very, very long time.
Yeah, it's kind of like holding onto the rudder of a super tanker and watching it do a really, really slow turn. And I think there are players in the food system who are able to turn the boat much faster than others. And I think there are some parts of the food system that have so much momentum and are so huge that it's actually really difficult for them to change direction or to react to the impact that they're potentially having. So I think it's sort of a mixed hand. But yes, I do think for most of the food system, they really are starting to realise the joined up bits in between, the mycelium networks that connect all of those big trees.
That's cool. That's great to hear. So what would it look like if we were to get investors and policy makers to truly start prioritising the way that which food is as kind of like a key infrastructure for New Zealand? How do you think that approach would change things? Would it speed up that momentum?
Yeah, absolutely. A joined up plan, a vision. Don't want to say a North Star because we're in the Southern Hemisphere, but, a Matariki constellation perhaps. Just being able to bring everybody together to put on the table their ingredient and to make a meal out of it, because if we just stay at the ingredient level, we are all over the show, and we have these adverse outcomes that mean that while we have the capacity to feed 40 million people globally, we don't seem to have the capacity to feed our 5 million here at home. And I really don't think anybody wants that. I've never met a farmer that doesn't want to see their community well fed. You know what I mean? I've never met a New Zealander who thinks it's okay that other New Zealanders don't have enough food. So I think everybody wants the same outcome. It's just the platform in which we get together to design it together, to co-design it. And I think that looks like something like a national food strategy or a national food plan. I'm really not attached to whatever the hell you want to call it. And it's really not for me to decide what that is, but just call for everybody to sit down and strategically and purposefully design a food system for Aotearoa.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I love that analogy around, bringing it together as a meal and trying to solve this issue, because it is a huge issue that doesn't get talked about enough in New Zealand. We're very happy to talk about how we can feed 40 million around the world, and we need to target the right 40 million, but that right 40 million is not going to be too happy when we hear that there's a million or so that are struggling with food security here in New Zealand in the first place.
And this is wild, but it's more than a million. So it's 1 in 4
Yeah,
families now.
which is crazy. We're not a big country.
Who even are we? How are we
Yeah.
a food nation? How can we see ourselves that way? How can we stand on a global stage and speak to that? That's embarrassing. It's shameful. And we all have a role to play in walking back from that space, I think. And it's super important we do. And it's not just for how we are perceived globally, it's also for how we are perceived inside our country. And it's important to remember that only 16% of people live rurally or regionally in
Mm.
New Zealand, and the rest live in cities. So unless we collectively find a solution, then we are going to find ourselves in a position where the social license to keep farming and to keep exporting our food is going to completely disappear. And I don't think any of us want that.
No, definitely. And I think we're seeing a bit of that currently with the price. Like, everyone's going on about the price of butter and the price of meat and how everything is going up. And like you say, it's probably pushing more people into that a million or more. And as farmers, we don't want to see that. We want to be able to feed our local communities, see them thrive, because it helps us thrive as well. And yeah, there's just some sort of disconnect between where it leaves the farm gate and it being able to feed our local communities so they can thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also important to remember that farmers are eaters as well.
Mm.
And I have seen that over the years, this when things get really tight as a farmer, the ability to feed your family well can be
Mm.
restricted too. So it's not like farmers produce all of their own food and eat it all on their own farm. We know that's not what it is. And workers, people who work for you, are they being fed well? And do they have access to food that keeps them well? Because there's a difference also between having access to food and access to food that keeps you well. And we're starting to see a real drop in the number of families in New Zealand who are accessing fresh food. So that's fresh fruit and vegetables, meat, dairy, fish. And that's concerning too, because that means that we're eating more and more ultra processed food. And that's not what we want either. So it's not just food as a whole sort of zoomed out concept. It's specifically what we have access to as well. And I think sometimes that affects farmers as much as it affects any other eater in the country.
Yeah, exactly. And farmers aren't immune from that. They're just struggling away a lot of the time as well to feed their families too. So before we get further into this, do you want to give everyone a bit of a background on who you are, Angela?
Yeah, sure. I am the lead of Eat New Zealand, which is a not-for-profit food collective. Our mission is to reconnect people with where their food is from, specifically through our land and our ocean. I also co-own the food farm, which is a permaculture property about 40 minutes north of Christchurch in North Canterbury in the Waipara region. And we grow most of our own food, but our main purpose here is to help other people learn how to grow food. So we're a teaching farm. I could go on, but that's the short and the long of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty good overview. So if we are looking at New Zealand's current food security, what do you see as the biggest vulnerabilities within that?
I think it's multi-stacked, whether we're
Mhm.
talking about geopolitics, climate vulnerabilities, or just the ability to afford our food. And if we're talking about geopolitics, we're talking about including things like energy security. How much diesel do we have for how long if we couldn't import fuel? How do we manufacture our energy here? What happens if we lose our national grid or parts of our grid as a result of climate disruptions or weather events? We also have a really long, skinny country with a piece of water in between it. So we're really actually not well designed to move things around. And as we've seen variously over the last couple of decades, quite small things can really disrupt our major pathways to move food around the country. And then I guess food security also involves the ability to afford our own food. So we have some really, really significant pressures on our system. And yeah, it's definitely something we need to start thinking about much more than we have in the past.
Absolutely. And in your experience, how resilient do you think our food security as a nation is currently?
I guess if we talked about different aspects of our food, we'd have different answers to that question. So for things like grains, we aren't particularly secure at all because we import, up to 83% and sometimes more of our grains into the country. And that's not just grains for eating, that's also grains for animal feed. And so that makes us really vulnerable. And that is part of the reason that Eat New Zealand has focused on grains, because there's something we eat every day. And I don't often think we think about where grains show up in our diet. So it's everything from breakfast cereal to oat milk to the beer we drink to the bread we eat to the biscuits we consume. It goes on and on and on. It's something that we eat a lot of on a daily basis. Then if we think about something like milk and dairy products, we produce a lot of them, but it's the way in which we produce them and where they end up that we don't necessarily have great access to. So because we export most of what we produce as powdered product, there's a long complicated cycle to make it back onto our shelves. And I think for meat, yes, in theory, we have good food security, but again, it's how it makes it back to the people within New Zealand. And fresh fruit and vegetables, definitely. But again, if you talk to the horticultural industry, they have genuine concerns about national food security and the impacts of climate and also the encroachment of urban centres on some of that horticultural land. So we have different risks depending on what you're talking about. But overall, it's definitely not something we've addressed at all collectively at a bigger scale. And I think therein lies the problem. It's the lack of addressing or the lack of strategic thinking that will see us undone at some point.
Yes, absolutely. And we tend to not find those out or try to fix them until we have something that creates an issue. If you just, like I know we've talked about it before quite a few times around the many choke points that are across our food system in New Zealand, where a lot of our vegetables all go through one centre, and it's in Auckland, so they'll be sent north and then come all the way back down, or things that happen around the earthquakes in the South Island where it was really hard to get food into these places. There was just nothing in a system or a way that was created to alleviate those problems that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's so centralised, and part of that is because of our supermarket duopoly and the fact that we now have these massive distribution centres that are designed for just-in-time delivery. That's kind of that modern logistics. So there just there's not fat in the system. So if anything goes wrong, things start to fall apart pretty quickly. And I know that we definitely saw that during Cyclone Gabriel, where they had to find food for the people waiting in line to get into the supermarket to find food. Or personally, after the Kaikoura earthquake, where we had to find a way to get over a very damaged set of hills called the Hunderlees with a couple of trucks and a inflatable to get food onto the inflatable to get it out to a fishing boat on the point to drive to sort of steam round into Kaikoura. Or after the Christchurch earthquake, when we were involved in setting up a farmers market really soon after the earthquake, to realise that that community had actually started to run out of food because all the supermarkets on the east side of the city were closed. We have real lived experience of what running out of food quite quickly looks like. And I think people always imagine that somebody will fix it for them.
Mm.
But what we've found is it's actually community that comes up with the solutions. And they are patched together out of whatever anybody can come up with at the time. Do you know what I mean? And that's well and good until it's not. And we could alleviate these issues by being way more strategic and planning in a much better way by decentralizing our food system so that instead of having to get the bag of potatoes from sector 1 to sector 7 in an emergency, the potatoes were already growing in sector 7 and being stored there. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We need to approach the way we design our food system to give us better food security as communities.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite a hard one because I guess the way that the food system has currently moved, or the agricultural system, is it's everything's kind of got bigger and less centralized, and they've cut out a lot of the fat. So is that a one of the tripping over points to try and somewhat reverse that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it looks like two food systems personally.
Yeah.
So you have a big centralized system that's designed to consolidate and export ingredients as commodities, or if you do it, value add and to export it as a high value product. And that's totally okay. And because we can feed 40 million people, there's no issues with that. We don't have to impact on that in order to feed ourselves. But we do need to focus a little bit on how we feed ourselves and how we design a food system for our 5 million here. And so I always say, it's not about not exporting. Exporting's fine, but as well, and we have to design a system that works for us as New Zealanders. And historically that just hasn't happened. There's been no resource, no strategic thinking. The idea, I think, because we were such an abundant country, is that we could always find a way to feed ourselves and just left it up to, whatever happened. But times have changed, and because we've got this massive centralization of our system and fewer players as part of that system, and the environment for our smaller food producers has got more and more difficult, we just run the risk of not having food here for ourselves. And I just don't think that's good enough.
No, and people just don't think about this, do they? I think until it affects them, which we've seen in various climate events around New Zealand and other disasters. But many of those people have still probably kind of put it in their back of their mind because, let's say, in an earthquake sense here in Christchurch, it's been quite some time, so people probably forgot that the food system actually broke as part of what was happening in that area. So it is quite hard to get people to think strategically and not in a silo, and how can we actually build some resilience in our farm, or not just in our farm, but our food and our communities.
Yeah, definitely. We all suffer from short termism, and we're
Yes.
really particularly bad at thinking long term. But I do think it's starting to show up more and more. I've seen more food system conversation in the last 6 months than I've seen in the last 10 years. And I think when things like ingredients get really expensive, or families have to start changing what they're eating, then I think it really hits home. And I would sound that as a warning bell, because in all my time, people have talked about this rural urban divide. And I have said it doesn't exist. It's something that's made up to create a division, that it's something that's talked about to other people. But the truth is that most New Zealanders genuinely support their farmers and genuinely support their food producers. However, I can see that there's a dangerous space ahead, in that if people cannot afford ingredients that they know are being produced down the road, and they also can't access water that is good for them, and it doesn't have really high levels of nitrates, that there will be a moment in time when that rural urban divide does become a reality. And I don't think we're there yet, but I am worried that we're moving in that direction.
I would like to parrot you on that. I definitely don't think there has been the rural urban divide that everyone's been going on about for quite some time now, but it does feel like we're on that precipice of that now. And just because there is a lot of conversations around the price of ingredients and the food system, people are becoming disgruntled. And it's going to be directed at the farmers, it's not the people in between. But things like waterways is a red herring that seems to be not talked about. and I think that chicken is going to come home to roost very quickly, and farmers need to, well, actually, that are the best ones at fixing it, and they'll have the pragmatic outcomes. But if we keep saying that they're the best farmers in the world and there's no issues here, the solutions aren't going to come and they're not going to come quickly.
I really loved your mixed bird metaphors there. That was
Yeah,
outstanding.
there's,
There's quite a few of them.
yeah,
There's something about a red heron and then a
yeah,
chicken coming home to
chicken,
roost.
yeah,
And I agree. And here's a
diversity in the
perfect,
system.
I love it. Um, Here's a really good example. Selwyn district. So there has just over the last few days been a report released that shows that over 50% of wells tested in the Selwyn district, which is just south of Christchurch, tested over acceptable levels of nitrates. The Selwyn district is the fastest growing district in Canterbury, and there is estimated to be 17,000 more households in that district in a relatively short period of time. It's also the part of the country where we're seeing some of the most significant dairy conversion. And interestingly, the number I've seen bandied about is 17,000 more cows. What a weird coincidence. And the Selwyn District Council is currently spending millions of dollars looking at a new water source for the community. And who knows if they'll find it and what state it'll be in. So I just look at a district like that and I think that's just as clear as the nose on my face. You know, that's where tension is going to come into that conversation in that situation. And I would just really hate to see the farmers be the people that are put on the chopping block for that, because I just think that's, it's unfair. If we can show them pathways, if we can show the people who are living there and farmers the pathway to an outcome to that now, rather than waiting for it to completely disintegrate into a really, not a good place, then now's the moment to do that. And I think that's really important. And I'm really excited to see, that there are farmers who are working out how to reduce the amount of nitrates that end up in the waterway using different practices. And I think that's to be encouraged and supported. And I know that you're doing lots of that in your space. And I think that's really hopeful. So I know that the solutions are there, but I am worried about where we're heading.
Yeah, and Selwyn is a district that's very close to my heart, considering done most of my work with farmers in Canterbury there, and there's some really cool people within that. But there is also a pressure from the industry to change the practices that aren't, well, to continue what's happening now. And there are solutions, like you say, that are not massive farm system changes, and some of them actually result in more profit, which farmers don't seem to hear when they think of pulling out in nitrogen or doing other I guess climate or environmental friendly farming practices, because that's not the narrative that's sold by our industry, because you need in fertilizer to be profitable as a dairy farmer, and that's not exactly true. So it's quite frustrating when you work with farmers, because you're actually working with preconceived ideas that you've basically got to get them to shift to see that problem. And I'm not sure a lot of them actually realise how bad it is currently, or how that their individual farm fits into that larger issue that's happening out there.
Yeah, and I'm worried about things like legacy loading. You know,
Yeah.
we're only just starting to see the beginning of that and how long
Mm.
the tail of that is and how much it'll increase. So yeah, if I was farmers, man, I'd be getting ahead of the game right now.
Yeah, yeah,
Before we
absolutely.
end up
That
in this.
legacy loading is a huge scare, because what are we doing right now might actually be improving things compared to the legacy loading, or it could be making it worse or the same. But we will just not find out for a very long time, unfortunately.
Mm.
Which is a big topic that in itself. So we hear a lot about the role of small farms or creating more of a localized food system for our communities. What opportunity do you see here for New Zealand, or maybe even how does that play into what's happening here in, say, Selwyn, where we've got these big issues that are on the precipice?
Yeah, a huge opportunity for small farms. We talked about this sort of two food system model where our big farms produce food that's exported, but what's the opportunity for our smaller farms to feed us as New Zealanders? And we've got this sort of weird history of of lifestyle blocks. I cannot tell you how much I do not like that term. These bigger farms that were carved up and were sold as bigger pieces of land. And I live on one of them, and I have done for 20 years. And when we bought this property, there was something called a loss attributing qualifying company rebate or tax return, as long as we could show that we had developed a business as part of that, owning that land. And that was stopped probably about, I want to say 12 years ago, maybe longer. But what I saw it did in our community and other communities is it filled small farms with things like horticulture, with nut orchards and olive orchards and, ways of actually producing food on small farms. And so one of my questions is, can we tweak settings so that we can get back to a point where there is an advantage for small farm owners to grow food to feed us? But I understand that's not enough. I also understand there's something that we call the infrastructure of the middle, and this relates back to a model or a framework we designed for our Land and Water National Science Challenge called the mana-centred local food system framework. And what it does is it shows that there is this bit in the middle between what we grow and what we eat that has its own trip points, has its own hurdles that need to be overcome. And so that's everything from that sort of first mile aggregation. So that's, how do you turn it from milk out of a cow into something that's pasteurized? Or how do you turn it from grain into something that's milled? Or how do you turn it from a live animal into something that you can butcher? So there's this first mile aggregation piece to be solved. And there is actually quite a lot of innovation in that space, and that's growing quickly. Everything from on-farm pasteurization and dispensing units to on-farm mills to micro abattoirs. There's lots of innovation and hope in that space. But then there's the next step, and it's how do you hold and distribute that food? And then there's the final step, which is called last mile distribution. And often last mile distribution can be the most complicated of all. And that's how you get it from being a final thing that can be sold, final product, to the eater. And because we have this huge predominance of supermarkets, our only solution in that space has, for the last 40 years or so, has been supermarkets. And that's when the system falls down for small food producers, because they don't fit into that model. And so we have to imagine last mile distribution as well. So that could be anything from a farmer's market to a CSA system to a community response or activation for how we find our local food. And then the other really important part of the mana-centred local food system is to acknowledge that this is all well and good, but how do we change it? So it's not enough to change our practice in terms of first mile distribution. We also need to create some enablers, so some demand change. How do we change demand so that it favours local food systems? And so we've got different ways we think that could be done as part of this mana-centred local food system. And that model, I think, holds within it the opportunity for small farms in New Zealand. And yeah, I can see there's a growing interest in those spaces. There's a lot of work between where we are now and where we could be, though.
Yes, yes. Unfortunately, there is so much interest, and there's a lot of people who want to operate small farms, but they just don't see how it can be a profitable thing for them, because I guess it is that last mile issue. Like, how do we create the demand? And in, I guess, the current society that we live in, everything kind of needs to be convenient and frictionless, or else we change our mind very quickly. So how do we build that into the system alongside the demand? Have you come up with any or seen any good ways of creating that demand?
Yeah, I have a few. The first thing to remember is that what we're talking about is culture changing. We're trying to
Yeah.
change the culture of people's behaviour. And that's really something to focus on. And culture change doesn't happen overnight. There is literally millions of dollars that have been spent telling us that convenience is king and that we don't have time to find our food anywhere else except for a supermarket. And that's all wrapped up in sort of that hustle culture and how we just have to work every single second of every day to make money so that we can afford food. And that's going to take a change in perspective and a change in culture. And that's going to be slow and difficult and hard. So I just want to put that on the table first. But there's also an acknowledgement that we can all do that. And there is so much power in that moment. This comes back to this idea of being a food citizen. So there's lots of things in our lives that we can't control, lots of things that are beyond our ability to change. One of them is not what we eat. We get to decide what we eat and where it comes from 3 times a day, if we're lucky. So each of us can make that decision every single day with what we choose to eat and where it comes from. So even if you said to yourself, right, I'm going to decide to choose one ingredient that comes from my local food system, or I'm going to put aside an hour a week to find food in my local food system, because I believe that that will create a multiplier effect and it will create a more thriving local food system, and I will be healthier as a result of it. We all have that power to do that, to put down this idea of ultimate convenience. We all have time. And when people say to me, I don't have time for that, I say to them, no, it's just not a priority for you right now. So we all get to choose what our priorities are. And there is time to find food from your local food system, but you have to decide to do it. So that's one piece. It's the cultural perspective change. It's the food citizen. I'm actually going to value this. Personally, this is something I can do to change the way that things are. And I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and I'm just going to do one small thing. And that's cool. And if everybody did one small thing, the whole system would change overnight. Do you know what I mean? And the multiplier effect of money in local food systems would be extraordinary. So even though it's a small thing and it's a long-term thing, its ability to tip the system is huge and probably the most powerful. There are other opportunities that sit around things like local procurement. So where are institutions and where are there policies that state that they will source food locally first before they go beyond that? So something like local procurement for everything from school lunches to hospitals to the Defence Force to the government to local government, everybody could have a local procurement policy. And in fact, most of the world does. New Zealand is so behind the 8 ball. All of our trading partners have some version of local procurement. And yet we hold on to this idea that we couldn't possibly do this because it would contravene our free trade agreements or something like that. There is no evidence of that. It's a shadow box. Do you know what I mean? It's like, ooh, this might happen. We can't possibly do that. It's, excuse my French, but it's bullshit. Of course we can do it. All we have to do is to decide tomorrow that we're going to do it. No one can call us on it because everybody else is already doing it. So we've backed ourselves into a corner of the sandpit where we play nicely, not realizing that no one else is in that corner of the sandpit anymore. So local procurement is one thing. We could do a whole lot of other things, including things like green prescriptions. So New Zealand used to lead the world in terms of green prescriptions that were designed for activity. But basically that means that you'd go to the doctor and they would be able to prescribe fresh food as a recommendation for how you dealt with your health issues. And that fresh food could obviously come from local food systems. You could also have local food dollars, so that money that you did have for food was worth more if you spent it in your local food system. And then getting back to that idea of tax rebates or rate rebates or something that encourages local food producers to exist in the first place. So there's just a few things.
All very powerful. The culture piece is really intriguing because we do see, even though we've got this hustle culture that is very prevalent, there's also a part of that that is now building is that you've got to look after yourself and the health building alongside it, which kind of doesn't align with the hustle if you really think about it, your nervous system. But I feel like as people, we are becoming more wanting to know where our food is coming from. And we do realize that it is good for us. But how do we create a system where that is accessible for everyone? Because cost obviously becomes a limiting factor. But I also like to think that if you pay the producer now, you're not paying the doctor further down the track, hopefully, as long as you're eating good quality.
Yeah, and this is so interesting because this is actually another myth that we've been fed along the way, that
Yeah.
somehow the food in our supermarket is cheaper than our
Yeah.
local food. It's not
Yeah.
true. So, for example, Farmers Market New Zealand did a survey that shows that the same basket of goods on the same day was cheaper from the local farmers market than it was from the supermarket. And we're seeing this sort of reconnaissance or renaissance of independent butchers because they are now able to shorten that supply chain and cut out some of the middle. And so meat is starting to be cheaper from independent butchers than it is from the supermarket. And we have to be really careful when we think that the supermarket is the cheapest place to find our food.
Yeah.
And you should really test that theory. And then not only is it cheaper, but it's fresher and it lasts longer. And you have a huge opportunity to actually find food that's good for you and good for your health. But we need to do it fast. We need to make that switch fast because our small food producers' livelihoods are really marginal and really tough at the moment. So we all have a responsibility, yes, to look after our own health and to see food as a solution to good health and to connect food and health. But don't wait, because if you wait, those solutions won't be there anymore.
Yeah, and it's probably will be even harder to create that system the further we go down. It seems like a lot of what we have at the moment in regulation doesn't seem to support the enablement of small producers as well, which is another barrier, which to me, I just don't get it. Like, it's, I guess they're trying to protect the population from something that's not really a bit as big a risk as they're saying. But
Well,
um,
our food regulations and policy settings have been designed for our big export companies.
yeah,
So what happens is that our small food producers find themselves in a situation where those compliance costs are so overwhelming that they can't make it work. And so, as an example, spoke to my local food compliance officer. By the way, they're always pretty good people. Some of them aren't, but most of them are actually really good humans who are absolute enablers and really want to see small food businesses get up. And her estimation was that about 5 to 10% of the people who approach her about a small food business actually make it to the starting line.
geez.
So really, really poor conversion.
Mhm.
And what can we do? How can we, again, strategically design a system that actually enables and supports small food producers to get to that starting line and doesn't take them out of play with compliance costs before they can even get to base, to the first base. And I think that's a
Abs-
huge conversation. It's one we're going to have at our upcoming Eat New Zealand Hui by bringing together some of the key people that are addressing that around the country.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hearing what comes out of that and hopefully some solutions to this problem, because it is such an opportunity that I feel like is almost being wasted. Are you seeing, like, do you have any examples of really good regional initiatives that are creating like a localized food system here or overseas?
Yeah, I can't think of a region in New Zealand right now which isn't stepping into local food system design and finding different solutions. In fact, I think it's where all the movement's happening. I think both in terms of grass and flax roots, I think there's a huge movement in terms of Māori food sovereignty as well. And it makes me really excited and really hopeful. The problem is it's not coordinated, it's not resourced, it's not
Mm.
supported in any way. So what you have are these amazing abilities to sort of take a leap forward, and then those leaps get decimated because it relies on volunteer work and having a driver who doesn't burn out, and the community's ability to volunteer or lean in, which gets much more difficult as the cost of living goes up. So there's an incredible will and a push, but no support. And it's just such an easy win. And I think it would really transform things pretty much overnight if those initiatives were supported and resourced properly.
Absolutely. Like, I think a lot of them just need a little bit of support, and that would just make them go so much faster and just create like an actual quite a bit of momentum,
Yeah,
and
and
that would
these are
change things.
organisations that are literally know how to survive off the smell of an oily rag. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, put a little bit of fuel in that tank and they'll go forever. These are
yeah.
not big bureaucratic, huge organizations. These are community led responses who know how to get shit done and know how to move fast, know how to pivot, know how to find solutions. They're community designed. They're just such an obvious one to support from my perspective.
I totally agree. And like, the return on like dollars going there is just incredible. Like just because they can run on a small an oily rag and like they just want to get it done. Like there's no barriers. They just find solutions, which is awesome to see.
Yeah, they're driven, purposeful, passionate, invested people. Yeah, it's money so well spent.
Yeah, I totally agree. So you've spoken about the importance of grains or New Zealand grains. Why is our grain market here in New Zealand one of our weak points within our food system?
Well, I don't think it was always that way. I think, traditionally we were awesome at grains. I always think back to, the pasta factory in Timaru or the oat industry in Southland. We had a really thriving arable system, but we then deprioritised that as we started to import more, and we also deprioritised the infrastructure that supported it. And so now we find ourselves in this weird space where it's cheaper to import grains from Australia to the North Island than it is to ship them from the South Island. So most other parts of the world that are designed like New Zealand, where the country sits across a piece of water, that piece of water is seen as an extension of the state highway. And so it's subsidised, it's supported. And that's not the case in New Zealand. So that strip of water is a commercial strip of water. So that means that we produce most of our grains on the South Island, but eat most of them in the North Island. And it also means that as other aspects of agriculture have taken the pole position and really dominate our agricultural systems, that arable has been deprioritised. So, for example, that means it's really difficult to get spots on coastal shipping or on trains or whatever for arable, and some of the infrastructure that then might supply those ways of moving grain around the country have also been mothballed. It's sort of like a house of cards or a set of dominoes. You sort of lose one part and then it tips over the next part and so on and so on. And so we've seen this consolidation of dairy as the thing that New Zealand produces. And in lots of ways, that has diminished the ability for arable to function. And another example of that is that at various points along the way, feed wheat has been worth more than milling wheat. So that means wheat that we feed our animals is worth more than wheat we feed ourselves. So we have these really perverse outcomes. And yet, we produce some of the highest quality milling wheat in the world. There's a piece of research that was done that showed that we sat just behind Canada and above everyone else in the world. The carbon footprint of our grains is really low, and it's wonderful, nutritious food for us as New Zealanders. So we had an advantage. We were really good at it. We have some of the highest experience and quality and amazing arable farmers anywhere. We have amazing rotation systems. So we had this advantage globally and we've let it go. And it's such a shame. And I feel like there's so much opportunity in the arable space for some of these incredibly talented farmers who have amazing systems. And I really like to see us get back to the point where we are known globally for our arable system. How cool would that be?
That'd be incredible. And no one really talks about what you said. Like, we've got some of the highest quality produce in the world and also really low carbon footprint, which is people are becoming more increasingly searching for, but we're not selling that. And it's really hard to see because our arable sector has some really incredible knowledge in it that is still floating around. And there's this next generation of farmers who would love to do it, but they just don't think they'll be able to keep their family farms for the next generation if they carry on doing what they're doing, which is a complete disconnect from the quality of what they're producing and the ability and the way in which they farm. So how do we change that? Because otherwise, at the rate we're looking at now, we're going to see a lot of farms convert to dairy farms, and then even more of a consolidation down of those small arable farms.
Yeah, and that's what we're working on with the Foundation for Arable Research is something called a grain mark. So what we found, New Zealand has been working with FAR for a few years now. And what we found is that when we went to the big end of town, to the supermarkets and the big bakers and even the mills and said, hey, New Zealand grown grains. And they were like, yeah. And we go, how about it? Makes so much sense. Higher quality, lower carbon footprint, supporting New Zealand farmers. And they kind of went, meh. And we went, oh, bloody hell. Okay. Okay. That's not, the carrot's not going to get there. We can't. And in fact, it's worse than that. There's actually a lack of transparency. So what we see sometimes is those food manufacturers use imagery and narratives that make us think that the grains they're using come from New Zealand, when in fact they don't. So they trade on that opaqueness. There is no transparency, there is no provenance. And so we got a bit sick of the carrot and thought, ooh, I wonder what happens if we pick up a stick? And not in a nasty way, but what happens if we actually add some transparency to the supply chain and say, if you are going to talk about New Zealand farmers when you sell your bread or your hamburger buns, we want to know that you are using New Zealand farmers grown grain. And so we came to the point of a provenance mark. And beyond that supply chain, we also realised that there's very little awareness around ordinary New Zealanders thinking about where their grains come from. So often we think about where our meat comes from, where our vegetables come from, where our dairy comes from, but seldom do we think about where our grains come from. So it was also the opportunity to create an awareness campaign for everyday New Zealanders to seek out New Zealand grown grains. And so we're just about to launch that. Mark at our hui, Nadia Lim is an ambassador and a keynote for that. We are finding there's a huge interest across the supply chain in the industry to support the mark, which is really exciting. And so we'll see how we go. And I think that's the way forward.
Absolutely. And I think once the consumers are aware of it, then they will prioritise where they spend their money. Like if there's, say, you've got a bread company saying and putting up pictures of New Zealand farmers saying that they use their grain, but they're actually using a very small percentage of that. It kind of changes your imagery around what that company is.
Yeah.
One of my favorite bakery that's just moved into sort of close to my area is Bellbird, and they've got all the different types of grains on their breads listed above, like what the bread name is. And even here, people come in and ask, like, where's this grain from? Like, where's this wheat from? Which is, you don't hear that every day, but you're just getting in there a coffee or something, and someone's asking where the wheat's actually grown, and they're like, it's happily grown here in Canterbury, just up the road. And I'm like, how cool's that?
Yeah, and man, we have some pretty cool bakers in New Zealand, smaller bakers who are doing incredible things and making that connection with farmers.
Mm.
So yeah, Bellbird, Grizzly, Shelley Bay, Wellington, Wild Wheat in Auckland are really making sure that they're establishing direct relationships with farmers and really important ambassadors. So they're not producing the amount of bread that the big end of town is, but they are absolutely leading the narrative and the way forward. And it's really exciting working with those bakers because they hold such a vision and they're so enthusiastic and passionate about our arable farmers. So yeah, we think that's super important.
That's the cool thing is they actually are so passionate about the way in which their farmers that supply them farm. Like they actually get right in behind it and they're excited to tell that to people. You can't ignore that energy when it gets said to you in
You
store.
never ignore the energy of a baker. That is a
No,
mistake,
yeah,
especially at about 5 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
special humans. I can tell you, I know a lot of chefs and a lot of bakers, and they're all special humans. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And they have the ability to change the world. Absolutely.
Mm, absolutely. So if we are to zoom out, Ange, 20 years down the track, and we're looking at basically New Zealand as a larger community, how do you see regional and community food networks playing out?
I would like to see this two food system come into existence. So I'd love to see a decentralization of the way that we
Mm,
feed ourselves and love to see community sized responses to everything from retailers to food production. I would like to see a thriving movement of kai motuhake or Māori food sovereignty, and for us all to understand that the way forward is partnership. And I would like to see healthy New Zealanders, children whose potential isn't limited by the fact that they don't have enough to eat or that what they're eating doesn't make them thrive. I don't think that's too much to ask. That's pretty much it. What do you reckon?
No, yeah, it sounds like pretty much my vision as well.
Let's
How
just
do you
make it.
fit? Yeah, let's just make it happen. So, how do you, if we were to make that vision happen, how do you think, like an everyday Kiwi, what is their part to play within that?
Yeah, just as we were alluding to before, you have the ultimate power. You are a food citizen. You have all the power every single day in determining what you eat. And if it's as simple as turning over a packet and making sure it's got a New Zealand grown grains mark on it and choosing that packet over the other one that doesn't, you are actually changing our world. It's not even that complicated. You just have to step into a space of mindfulness about it and be aware of the impact that your decisions are having. And I know that it's really easy to discount food in terms of its importance to our health, in terms of it's something that we trade away from when the cost of living gets high. But there are solutions out there that don't cost you any more money. They just cost you a bit more brain energy to think about where you might find them from. So I guess that's the biggest chance for us to create the food system that I suspect we all want, and it sits with all of us.
Mm, absolutely. So, if someone listening along to this wants to connect with you, Ange, what's the best way to follow you in your journey or get in touch?
Yeah, we Eat New Zealand on social media. Instagram is our biggest platform, so join us there. We're also having a hui in Tamaki, Auckland on the 6th and 7th of October. Not sure when this will air, but that's a really good way to join along. We've also got a fundraising dinner the night between the 2 days, which includes some of the country's most exciting chefs. We've got a cohort of next generation food leaders and lots of our young chefs who are really changing New Zealand food. So we have a dinner between those 2 nights. So I encourage people to have a look at that. The Food Farm is our home business, and again, Instagram is the biggest channel for us there. We've just written a book called The Food Farm,
Absolutely.
on brand, which is the story of Nick and my life here over the last 20 years on a small farm. And it's an invitation to live a more seasonal life, collection of sort of our 60 most foundational recipes and stories, seasonal stories of our lives here. So I encourage people to go and find that. Yeah, I think that's enough, isn't it? Is that enough?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. How did you find the experience of writing a book?
Wouldn't recommend it. But got it done somehow. Don't even know how. We were approached by a publisher, by Bateman, and I was like, there is no way I have time to write a book. Are you mad? And they're like, oh, Ange, I reckon you could. And they were so patient and so kind. And somehow I found the time. I don't know how. But it is a beautiful record for us as a family of our lives
Mhm.
here. And I genuinely think it will be a really useful book for people. So it's really about cooking from scratch and using ingredients that you've grown. And whether that's what you're doing right now or whether that's what you hope to do in the future. So, for example, it's, how to make sausages. It's not a recipe with sausages in it. So it really is designed for people who are interested in where their food comes from and how they might cook to create better outcomes for their health and for the planet. Yeah, so I guess it feels purposeful, but wouldn't recommend it as a good time writing it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, the book is beautiful from the one you showed me, so
thanks.
it has come out pretty good.
Thanks.
No worries. And to finish up, I normally have a couple of quick fire questions. The first one is, what's one thing you would change about the agricultural industry?
The word industry,
Yep.
chuck that out because that just frames agriculture as one thing, right?
Yep.
Agriculture is so many more things than an industry. Agriculture is culture, it's
Mm,
people, it's community, it's social outcomes, it's environmental outcomes. It's not just industry. And I think as long as farmers see themselves as industry, they're limiting their potential and the outcomes. So chuck out that word industry and I'd be happy. How's that?
That would without a doubt be the best answer to that one I've had. I love
Oh
that.
my
That's
God,
so
the
good.
pressure's on for the next one.
Yeah. And finally, what is a force of nature to you?
Wow. I don't think anybody that in Canterbury that has survived three major earthquakes could answer this question any other way. I think that once you have felt the earth under your feet move like that and feared for your life, that you can in any way not understand that the force of nature is so significant and we are so insignificant in comparison. We are but ants, really. And so I think for me, the force of nature is a reminder of our insignificance in the face of natural systems. And that should encourage us to be humble, but also encourage us to understand that things will change. And when they do, they will change quickly. And that we need to work hard on our resilience now to ensure that when the force of nature shows itself, as it does every day and will continue to do, that we understand we are part of nature, that we are connected to nature, that nature is not something that we can control. And that's it.
Totally agree. So thank you very much for coming on today, Ange. It's been an awesome time to chat about kind of one of my increasingly favourite topics around the food system. And I've learned a lot from you already. So thank you very much for your time today.
I have absolutely loved it, and I've actually enjoyed all of your episodes. And I'm so excited to see someone like you having this podcast and really encourage people to support you and to find these ways to keep telling these stories, because I actually think it's really important. And yet you're really good at it. And keep up with your social media too. I love it. I think it's so cool. You're doing a wicked job. And I can't see a lot of other people in this space doing it. So keep going. It's awesome.
Thank you very much.